Good morning, everybody. This is Stephen Pugh of the Home Bible College. We have another installment in the long story of the production of the King James Bible, which we call in England the Authorized Version. And we're going to be reading and referring to this book, and we have other books as well that we're referring to. But we're today looking at chapter 5, which is called Explaining the Hard Places, and this is all about the Geneva Bible. Now, the English translation of the Bible that did more than anything to shape the English religious thought throughout the long reign of Elizabeth I was produced in the city of Geneva in 1560. And it's very interesting that when Shakespeare makes quotations in his various plays, he's quoting the Geneva Bible. Very interesting. And it's also exceptionally interesting that the greatest and certainly the most interesting tribute to the popularity of the Geneva Bible is the remarkable fact that when citing from the Bible, in the preface to the King James Version, chose itself to use the Geneva translation rather than the new translation that the preface was intended to introduce and commend. The greatest obstacle faced by the King James Version as it sought to establish itself in the 17th century was the continuing popularity of the Geneva Bible. So Shakespeare used it. Even the translators of the King James Version used the Geneva Bible when quoting the Bible in their preface to the Authorized Version. As we also see, the Geneva Bible did rather more than offer an acceptable English translation of the entire Bible, including the Apocrypha. It offered comments in the text which often expressed the radical Protestant ideas associated with Geneva at this time. Now, there were a lot of ideas that they had in Geneva which were quite offensive and repulsive to the English, and that became a problem. So you see, Geneva was a republic. It had no king, and they had a strong interest in spreading republicanism. As much as they did Protestantism throughout Europe, the Geneva Bible threatened to undermine the entire structure of the church and state that had been set up under Henry VIII and continued more or less unchanged under Elizabeth I. So how did this enormously influential Bible come into being? Why was the household Bible of Elizabeth I, the English Protestants produced in Geneva? Now then, that's a very interesting question. Now we need to look at the Reformation in Geneva, and we will understand a lot more about the subject. Now, the origins of Geneva go back to a settlement established in Roman times. Its geographical location helped it to become at the very crossroads of Europe, in which traders from Northern Europe, with their colleagues from the south and especially Italy, it was a crossroads. It also had 4 international trade fairs held every year from 1262 onward. So important was Geneva as a trade centre that the immensely wealthy Medici family even reckoned it worth establishing a bank in the city. And yet Geneva was not a free city. It was enjoying the privileges of the great it was not a free city enjoying the privileges of the great imperial cities such as Strasbourg. It was part of the Duchy of Savoy, a territory high up in the French Alps. Its affairs were directed from the city of Annecy, some distance to the south. The citizens of Geneva did not like this arrangement, but there was little that they could do about it. It was just one of those things of history that happened. Yet many in Geneva were looking enviously to the east, where the Swiss Confederation was growing in power and prosperity. Now, some leading citizens in Geneva arranged an alliance with the Swiss city of Prigburg in 1519 without permission from their political masters. The pact was promptly annulled by Savoy, and the leaders of the delegation that negotiated the pact were publicly executed shortly afterwards. You know, these were brutal days, and politics could turn on a dime and people could be executed for treason. But this merely increased many Genevans' longing for independence and gave new momentum of finding ways to break free from foreign control. In 1526, Geneva, again without Savoy's permission, entered into a pact with the Swiss city of Bern. This was a major development. Not only was Bern a major economic centre, it also possessed a large standing army, which was perfectly prepared to use to support its allies. One of the things that happened was that the Swiss reformer Huldrych Zwingli, born in 1482, from Zurich, the Reformation spread rapidly to other Catholic cities in the region. Typically, what would happen is there would be a public debate. A public debate would be arranged by the city councils with representatives of the Reformation being pitted in debate against their Catholic opponents. A binding vote was then taken within the city's ruling body as to whether the city should accept the principles of the Reformation, and in 1528 Bern voted to accept the Reformation. Now, Geneva now found itself in an interesting position. The Bern it had allied with in 1526 was Catholic, but in 1528 it became Protestant. You see how these things could swip and change. More than that, it was actively campaigned for its allies to accept the Reformation. Now, a public debate took place in 1534 within Geneva itself. Although the result was not that clear-cut, and the city lurched decisively into a Protestant direction, in 1534 the city declared independence from Savoy, and its public adoption of the principles of the Reformation. Coins were minted to celebrate the event, and on the coin was printed "Post tenebras lux," which means "after the shadows, light." That's a great motto, isn't it? Savoy was alarmed and promptly sent an army to sort out their religious colony. By January 1536, the city was surrounded and cut off from its neighbours, and capitulation seemed inevitable. However, Bern was determined to support its ally and simultaneously extend its influence in the region. By February, the Burmese armies had swept westward, occupying every Savoyard possession in their path, and Geneva was now free from the rule of Savoy. In practice, it would remain a vassal of Bern for years to come. In the summer of 1536, Geneva was settling down to its new status as a Protestant republic, and there had been a massive outflow of Catholic professionals in the aftermath of the Revolution in 1535 and the siege of January 1536. The city needed lawyers. It also needed help with the consolidation of the Protestant Revolution initiated the previous year. And so the person that comes onto the scene is John Calvin. Now, John Calvin was born in 1509 and lived till 1564, and he is one of the most significant players in the great religious debates and developments in the 16th century. His name in French was Jean Calvin, to use his French name, and was born in the French city of Noyon, about 70 miles northeast of Paris. His father was involved in the financial administration of the local diocese and could rely on the patronage of the bishop to ensure support for his son's career. And young Calvin was sent to the University of Paris, and from now on he would be known by the Latinized version of his name. It was changed from Jean Calvin to John Calvin. After completing his undergraduate studies in Paris, he moved to Orleans to study civil law. Calvin's father originally intended that his son should study theology with a view to entering the priesthood. However, he changed his mind, and because the study of law was much more financially lucrative. During this period, he became increasingly sympathetic to the Reformation ideas. The Parisian authorities immediately took action against Cobb and his circle because their Reformation was becoming very strong, and including Calvin, they set about rounding them up, and Calvin realized that he was a marked man, and he fled. He fled initially to Paris, fearing for his safety, and eventually the following year he settled in the Swiss city of Basel. Now then, it was known as a place of political and religious asylum, safe from the threat from the French authorities. It was in this city that he began to publish in Latin, meant for the intelligentsia, for the educated scholars, his Institutes of the Christian Religion. Now, the Institutes of the Christian Religion began very small and just became added to and added to and added to until it became today this vast volume from John Calvin. Calvin decided to settle in the German city of Strasbourg. The activities of the French and German armies caused him to take an indirect route to his destination, passing through the city of Geneva. Calvin intended to spend a night there and then resume his journey in the morning. However, as Calvin would say, divine providence intervened. He was recognized by Geneva's Protestant leaders as the author of the Institutes, and they demanded that he stay and help consolidate the Reformation in Geneva. Now, there were a number of problems with Calvin's stay there, and Calvin believed in Geneva's political independence, and particularly in matters of religion. But there was a difference. For example, the Bernese churches celebrated Holy Communion 4 times a year, whereas the Calvin wanted to celebrate communion every month. Now, not wanting to alienate their powerful ally, the Genevan City Council insisted that Geneva fall into line. What Bern wanted, Bern would get. Calvin protested, and because of his protest, he was thrown out of Geneva in April 1538. So Calvin spent a period between 38 to 41 in exile back in Germany. It was no great hardship for him. His original intention 2 years earlier had been to settle in the great city and to get on with a life of scholarship. But in the event, Calvin was called back to Geneva in 1542. Political and religious instability had broken out in his absence, and the city council had reluctantly decided to ask him to come back. They wanted Calvin back. There was great scandals, there were great problems in the city. And the treaty between Bern and Geneva, signed after Bern had routed the Savoyard besiegers of the city in January 1536, and contained several obscure clauses that became the subject of some tension between the cities. A delegation of 4 Genevans travelled to Bern to negotiate a satisfactory resolution of the difficulties. The negotiations were conducted in Swiss German. However, the Genevan negotiators had clearly failed to understand the terms that they had allegedly negotiated. And this wasn't known immediately. It was only much later that this was discovered. In the next round of city elections, the faction was swept from power and the way cleared for Calvin to be invited to return to Geneva, and he accepted the invitation, and he would remain in the city until his death in 1564. Now, Calvin was a man of vision and recognized the importance of printing as a means of spreading the ideas of the Reformation in Europe. Calvin realized that Geneva's unique situation allowed it unrivaled position as a catalyst for Protestant revolution throughout Europe, and Geneva would produce both Protestant books, and highly motivated individuals would be able and willing to spread these ideas of the Reformation, although Calvin's primary concern would always be for his native France. He was not unaware of the critical role that educated English Protestant emigres would play in bringing about a Protestant revolution to England. As events made clear, the point was not lost on a group of English refugees who sought asylum in Geneva while they plotted the conversion of their native land to Calvin's cause. So under Calvin, Geneva became a symbol of the Protestant Reformation, and the biblical image of a city on a hill whose light could not be hid was widely applied to the fledgling Protestant Republic and achieved almost iconic significance to Protestants throughout Europe in the late 1540s and early 1550s. Now, the population of Geneva around 1500 was estimated to be about 5,000 people, or probably more than likely to be 5,000 families. But by 1550, 50 years later, it had climbed to 13,100 people, and merely 10 years later, it had reached 21,400. The main reason for this massive growth in its population was the influx of religious refugees, and mainly from France, but coming from other countries too. In England, when Mary Tudor came to the throne, the English Protestants who fled to Europe to escape religious persecution policies of Mary Tudor, who came to the throne in 1553, Edward VI, who reigned from 1547 to 53, was heavily influenced by a group of senior figures who were openly Protestant in their sympathies. And under Edward VI, many of the top Reform theologians were invited to England to take up important posts. Martin Bucer, for example, became Regius Professor of Divinity at Cambridge. Peter Martyr Vermigli to the Regius Chair at Oxford. It seemed it was only a matter of time before England consolidated its position as a Protestant nation. However, Edward's early death in 1553 put an end to these Protestant experimentations, and Mary Tudor was determined to re-establish Roman Catholicism within England, systematically eliminating all those who stood in her way. It's interesting to know that within a matter of just a few years, there were vast numbers of public burnings of Christians in England under Mary. And what brought all of that to an end, and to Mary's arrest, and finally, after a long time, to Mary's demise, was the complaints of the Catholics. You see, the burnings and the zeal of Mary was so hot and so voracious that actually even the Catholics bogged at the ideas and at the violence that she unleashed upon the country. She was not just burning Christians, she was burning bishops. That's incredible, incredible. Now, these English Protestants, that is those who could afford to do so, decided to go into exile to the Protestant cities of Europe, such as Geneva or Zurich, and to wait a change in the religious climate. According to John Fox, 800 persons, students and others together, fled England for refuge within the Protestant havens of Europe in the first few years of Mary's turbulent reign. It can be estimated that more than half of this figure of 800 were male, perhaps 450 of them, and of these, Fox estimated 148 were gentry, 74 were clergy, including 4 bishops, and 99 of them were students of divinity. So where did these emigres go to? They went to the Swiss cities of Aarau, Basel, Zurich, and the German cities of Emden, Frankfurt, and Strasbourg, and the independent city of Geneva. Okay, some were wealthy enough to support themselves in exile. Others received discreet financial support from well-wishers back home. In the event, the period of the Marian exile was a mere 6 years. In only 6 years, the persecution under Mary came to an end. In comparison to the 50 of their biblical counterpart, it was a period during which the exiles saw as one of schooling in preparation for their return, and their vision of the new Reformed Church of England is what kept them going. Now, Geneva attracted approximately 1/4 of the emigres. So, in Geneva then, there was a large number of exceptionally well-educated believers, religious Christians who had been persecuted for their faith in England. And they prayed and they worked for a Protestant national church in England. And one of the great weapons at their disposal was the printing press. So they began to print, and they printed in Latin, which was intended to be read by the European leadership, intended to justify the principles of the English Reformation to the intellectual elite. But the roughly 40 works were known in this category. But their works published in English were intended to be smuggled into England, where they were expected to find a ready readership, and roughly 120 works are known in this category. One of the most prolific of the Marian exiles was John Fox. We all know John Fox, the Fox's Book of Martyrs famously. But he was there, and he began to write about the English Lollards and their persecution, and he also wrote about other persecutions, and eventually his work broadened and broadened to include all persecution from the very earliest times of the Christian church right out into his own day. The most important single literary production of the Marian exiles was the English translation of the Bible undertaken in Geneva, which had simply come to be known as the Genevan Bible. There is no doubt that the success of this contribution led to the decision of James I in England to authorize a new English translation of the Bible. And at the Hampton Court Conference in 1604, James expressed his grave concern over the Geneva Bible. You see, just remember that the Geneva Bible was Republican in its outlook, and James was a king, and he didn't like their republicanism, and so he was fiercely opposed to it. He said that it was the worst English translation he knew. In fact, his judgment needs to his judgment needs careful scrutiny because his comments appear not only to apply to the marginal notes that accompanied the English translation, he didn't appear to have a problem with the translation itself, but he referred to it as a very partial, untrue, seditious, and savouring too much of dangerous and traitorous conceits. He didn't like it, did he? But the interesting thing is, he was interested in the traitorous aspect. He was interested in the danger, and the danger was, of course, to himself. Let's be honest, that's what it was about. And so, how did this translation come into being, and why did it prove so popular? To understand the issues, we must first consider a serious difficulty that had arisen earlier in the Reformation and the need for a reliable biblical interpretation. And we'll pick up this point, the question of the Bible, translation and interpretation, in our next episode. And we look forward to you joining us. By the way, please like and subscribe down below. This helps us immensely with YouTube. Well, God bless you all. We'll see you next time. Have a great day. Bye for now.